Alrighty, well, here we are. So my apologies here if the screen dropped a second ago. I was waiting for it to like bump up and it didn't. Hey, here we are. Welcome, everybody that's here. Appreciate everybody coming out. I'm sure we have better ways to spend our Good Friday / our Easter weekend than reacting to what could potentially be yet another InfoSec dumpster fire, right? So before I get started, I do want to credit, some folks that put this together. It always takes a village, right? There's a whole host of cadre, I say cadre, I guess faculty, SANS faculty, that have helped out with this throughout, and a couple of names that I'll throw out there. Rob Lee is the one who originally pitched this and said, hey, we should probably do this anyway. Whether there's a POC dropped or not. We had this discussion a day and a half ago, and I was like, I don't know. And based on the number of people on here, that was obviously the right call, even without a proof of concept dropping yet. So I'm confident actually, and I'll talk more about this as we get into it. The proof of concept is imminent, followed by active exploitation. When I say imminent, I'm going to go next 7 days. And I gravitate to earlier, than later, based on some of the vulnerability analysis, which we'll walk through. A couple of other folks I want to call out very quickly: Jeff McJunkin, Joe Gorenflow, and of course Johannes Ulrich, who have all been doing lots of internet scanning. Of course, Johannes runs the Internet Storm Center. Jeff McJunkin and Joe Gorenflow are both instructors at the SANS Institute. We've actually course authors too, but I won't swear to that. So anyway, getting started here, what are we going to cover, right? So first and foremost, a couple of RPC foundations, because I kind of feel like that's necessary for us to get started, so that we're all speaking the same language. Not RPC specifically, but so they're all speaking the same language about what is it that we're going to cover. We'll talk some about the vulnerability details. Again, there is no proof of concept, but I do want to walk through how this stuff is found, and give you a little bit of insight into that as well. Talk about how to investigate Microsoft RPC, and I'll walk you through a couple of tools there, as well as some protection and mitigations. Now, I got a caveat before we get going here, right? If you're looking for something rock solid that I know for sure is going to stop this, I don't have it, right? And so if you want to break away now is the time. We just don't have it because we don't have the proof of concept to test against. I haven't been able yet to crash a service, right? So as we do this vulnerability discovery, or I guess in this case, patch diff, creating a trigger file, I don't have a trigger that crashes a service yet. So I know where the vulnerability is at. That was the easy part, and we'll talk a little more about that too. But again, I'm rolling the dice here a little bit with the mitigations, but I think they're pretty solid, right? So I can say that with high confidence that if I were in a position where I couldn't patch, and in some cases even where I can patch, I'm still taking a hard look at the majority of these mitigations. And so then I'll wrap up with a couple of closing thoughts. So let's get going here. All right, I want to throw out a couple of references here. Microsoft, unsurprisingly, has really good information on how to troubleshoot RPC. Now, a lot of this is going to play around with Exchange in these documents, because that's a spot where lots of people have trouble with RPC. And I suspect it was written as a result of some Exchange troubleshooting issues, but gives really good foundations on how to work through troubleshooting, Microsoft RPC. And so yeah. And then Spectre Ops, they've done some really good work in the past with, I believe, Jared Atkinson, and I apologize, maybe Sean Metcalf, I'm dropping the name here for a second, but I did a great post on, like 40 some odd pages on detection engineering over RPC, right? And fantastic work. I remember reading this when it came out, I want to say 2019, 2020, and again, was just blown away. By the way, detection engineering is something that's going to be super hot coming up. It's a term you're going to hear a lot more about, I expect. So that they were way ahead of the curve, not only with RPC, but even the detection engineering side. I see a question in here asking, will the slides be available after the presentation? Absolutely, definitely. And in fact, I'm even sharing a packet capture during the presentation in case you want to illustrate how to look at RPC. Akamai also published the runtime vulnerability analysis. or the RPC runtime specifically, which is where the vulnerability is at. They published their vulnerability analysis, I believe, 2 days ago, and that's still probably the most comprehensive public write-up that I've seen up to this point. So, what is RPC generally here, right? So RPC was designed to allow a client to transparently call a function, so a client application to transparently call a function on a remote system, or in some cases, it could be another process on the same system. That's actually called ALPC, or Advanced Local Procedure Call. But the idea here is you don't have to understand the transport mechanisms at all, right? So yeah, you won't have to understand those transport mechanisms at all. You can just make a call using an interface and say, hey, call this function. And because you've linked in RPC, and I'm oversimplifying this just a bit, but because you've linked in the RPC code as a developer, you don't really have to think about how the code is going to get from one system to another, whether it's going to ride over HTTP, whether it's going to ride over SMB, whether it's going to ride over standard RPC, we'll use a named pipe, right? You don't have to worry about any of that, right? It's taken care of for you, right? And so then you can make this function call. Now a lot of folks are like, oh yeah, that's kind of like using an API on a remote system, like we think about like web APIs. And it's like, no, not really, right? There you do have to worry about the transport, right? Now, I know there are some libraries that abstract that away. And if you're using one of those to call that, basically to call some remote API and receive the results and parse those results and give you back something that's not just a JSON or an XML blob, then go you. You're using something that looks a lot like RPC. And that's really the concept here. Now, RPC is incredibly complex, right? It's probably one of the more complex subsystems in Windows. It underpins tons of the operations that we just take for granted in Windows itself. Now, there's been a lot of push where folks are like, oh, you just go block 445. Well, let's start right here. First off, when you use the word just to describe an InfoSec problem or cybersecurity problem generally, my first thought is you fail to understand the complexity of the problem. All right, so there is no just here. And I want to highlight this is not a complete range of ports. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, right? But right off the bat, right, you'll see then, yeah, and thank you, Waspa, for throwing that link in the question mark here. I'm actually going to drop this into our chat here. Where there's a big overview of ports and protocols and system and service ports. Let me go ahead and drop this in the chat so everybody has it, right? So everyone, there we go. So these are a couple of links here, but again, I just want to throw this out here that this is not even a complete list itself, right? So I cherry picked a couple of ports that I've seen actually in red team assessments that have been open. Not only do we have 135, obviously 139, 445, and 135 is the endpoint mapper, and we'll talk more about that. Here in a minute. But 139 and 445 allow us to do MS-RPC over server message block over SMB. Now Ned Pyle, Ned owns SMB at Windows, Microsoft, and he jumped out and he's like, look, this is not an SMB problem, right? He's like, SMB is just the transport layer. That's it, right? That's all it is. And so now there's also a transport layer over HTTP, and that's port 593. All right, now this is one that, action items getting off the webcast, go make sure that this is locked down as well. All right, we see too many of these port 593s exposed to the internet. That is probably not a good thing because this vulnerability is exploitable, we believe is exploitable pre-authentication, right? So there's no authentication required. As far as the ports go, for RPC services, unfortunately, they can ride practically anywhere in that ephemeral port range, which varies depending on which versions of Windows you're on. If you still have legacy Windows, that's 1025 to 5000, and ports 49152 to 65535, much larger range on our newer Windows systems, right? So our RPC services can actually listen on any one of those ports. And if you're asking like, well, what about well-known ports? That's what the endpoint mapper is for, and we'll walk through an example of that in a moment. Now, there are a couple of other well-knowns here that I grabbed out. Port 5722. This is used for DFS replication, but only DFS is a distributed file system replication, but only in Server 2008 and 2008 R2, right? So I grabbed this one as a cherry-picked example because you're gonna see as we start pushing through these this RPC exercise, which probably is not a one-off, right? You know, and I'll come back to that in a minute. You're going to have to really start looking at where do we have services running, and dare I use, you know, what's become really a vendor buzzword with zero trust, but I think this is going to make the case really well for really well for zero trust, right? So likewise here, the RPC messaging queue or message queuing, so that's the MS-MQ. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and drop here the Akamai. Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. Answer live. I'll get down there. My apologies, folks, if it seems like I'm taking a break here. I'm not. I'm trying to make sure that when people are dropping a link, I want to make sure it gets out to everybody in chat. So there we are. Okay. So RPC ports, right? On Shodan, Johannes Ulrich, you know, as of yesterday morning, published some counts here for publicly exposed Microsoft RPC services. Now, again, note on well-known ports, I probably should have bolded that, right? I think these are the only ones on the well-known ports. There's a lot, right? You notice here that there's a lot more 135 than 445. Jeff noted in his scans, you know, substantially more, although, you know, they're having to winnow some of these away for like Samba. Port 593 still has, let's go with too many, 12,000, right? It's 12,000 too many. But one of the things that struck me on this, you know, on this list was, or in these numbers, was that we had a big fire drill with that WannaCry thing. That WannaCry thing going on a couple of years ago, that big fire drill. You know, as a result of that, a lot of folks really went in and instead of taking action to, you know, block potentially vulnerable services that don't need to be internet exposed, they literally went in and said, block 445, block 139, we're set, right? The reality here, of course, right, is, and I think you're seeing that here, right? The reality is that we didn't do a good job, right? You know, the fact that there are 2 million, I say we, the global we, right, didn't do a good job. There's still 2 million hosts or 2 million endpoints exposed there. But again, these are just the well-known ports, right? I want to highlight back to, you know, the previous slide here, right, that there are lots of other less well-known ports that are running RPC services. And I also have to caveat, we don't know for sure if the code is going to be triggerable, the vulnerable code will be triggerable over those, you know, over those services, you know, non-standard ports. My guess is yes, in the, I say a majority, yes, in the circumstances where that code path can be reached, and I'll talk about why in just a second. So I do want to walk us through an example of the Portmapper just to make this a little bit more concrete. The idea here with port 135 is it is a well-known port that you can contact, and it will tell you where the other services are listening. Now, if you are a GCIA, if you're a GCIA or taken SEC 503, you probably have already experienced this. So if this is all Greek to you, SEC 503 is where you want to be. But otherwise, you know, again, this RPC Portmapper, basically you connect to it on port 135 and you say, I want to go talk to a service and a particular RPC service. And the Portmapper says, okay, here's the port to talk to. And then you'll make a separate connection to there, right? So to take this out of the abstract and make it a little bit more concrete, I want to walk you through a quick example. I used basically used my my system here to basically create a service on a remote machine called new serve2, and I gave it just a bin path and notepad. Now this isn't really going to launch notepad. We're not going to have a service, you know, this is already gone obviously, but this is just generating RPC traffic effectively. Now, obviously I had to have some connection, some established authentication to the machine first, or this would have failed. In fact, we just mapped a drive with admin permissions, or the IPC $sign actually, with admin permissions. Now, if you want to play along at home, you can go grab the packet capture, github.com, malwarejake public, and packets, and there's only one packet capture in there. There's some other stuff up there from some other SANS vendor webcasts, packet captures, right? From other SANS vendor webcasts that we've done that support those. But somebody told me I just had a typo in RCP in several bullet points. Yikes. Yeah, it is a typo and not another service. So my apologies there. Yes, okay, Yes, but yes, RCP. If you saw RCP, that's a typo. It's RPC, and my apologies there. So anyway, really appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and put that one there. Okay. So basically here again, if you want to grab packets, go ahead. I'm just going to go ahead and walk through this very quickly here. First, we're going to see the connection to the endpoint mapper. And once we make that connection to the endpoint mapper, make the connection to the endpoint mapper on basically on port 135. And in fact, you can see that here, right? So our port is 135. And then you can see that we have requested, right? Basically requested the service controller, right? So SVC control. You can see we've made the connection and it shows, port 135, that's in the request. Now we get back to the answer, right? You can see that the server comes back and says, hey, you can find the service control, repopulates that structure. NDR, by the way, I want to make clear here that NDR is not network detection and response, right? This is one of these spots where you have overloaded acronyms. This is network data representation, which is effectively basically the schema by which we're going to transmit generic RPC or serialize generic RPC requests over the wire. Separately, there's this idea of an IDL or MIDL, and that's interface description language, or in the case of Microsoft RPC, the Microsoft interface description language, right? So when you see NDR here, just know that's not network detection or response, right? So that's the network data representation. It tells me here, now go connect on port 49670. And in fact, we see exactly that, right? So next we see a connection to, and of course I'm skipping some packets here. If you're playing along at home, you can see that, right? But just highlighting on the good stuff or the best stuff. And so here we see the connection to 49670, and basically making that initial connection. Now again, if you play along, you do the same example on your system, not with my packet capture, but on your system and capture packets, your port probably won't be this, right? That's what the endpoint mapper is for, right? So you're going to have to go back and look at filter on TCP port 135 for the endpoint mapper, and then go inside there and find the basically find what the ephemeral port is that you're connecting to. Usually those are fairly tight in sequence, but if you've got a bunch of background network traffic, it can be a little bit harder to find, right? And then finally, we see then the call of the OpenSC Manager, right? SC being the service controller, right? By the way, if you ever hear a dev talk about the SCUM, right? This is the SCUM right here, right? So the service control manager. And here then you can indeed see, well, not only actually the source host, right? The account that we use to connect, and of course the machine name, and ultimately the rest of the parameters are obviously passed across, serialized and passed across here. Now, why am I walking you through this, right? When we could be talking about the vulnerability. Don't worry, we're going to do that next. But why are we walking through this? Because this is moderately complex. RPC services tend to be stuff that I find even folks that are general, dare I say, network ninjas, often don't have a good understanding of this. And I have a feeling, just a slight feeling, that you're going to be called upon over the next several weeks as InfoSec professionals to examine potentially, right, network traffic with RPC, right? And even if you aren't, I would say that for those that are, there is a ridiculously higher chance next week than there was last week, right? So wanted to go ahead and arm you with the tools there. And again, this is all stuff that we cover in Sec 503. Likewise, I think Bill still has some content on RPC, and I know he has a lot on SMB in Forensics 572, and that's the network forensics course, right? So let's jump out of this and take a hard look at the vulnerability details, right? Akamai basically highlighted changes in the code. Now, well, I don't want to say sad, but I do need to make this caveat. If you look at my screenshots and you're like, those don't align exactly with what Akamai did, I know, right? I totally know. I don't know, specifically which version of Windows they're on, right? From a language, not a language pack, but a language version of Windows. I know that one of the researchers, there is Israeli. One of the ones that published the blog post is Israeli, and so it's not out of the realm of possibilities that they were on a Hebrew workstation versus an English, U.S. English workstation. at the end of the day, our offsets are going to be a little bit different here as you look at, and you're like, your numbers don't align with theirs. That's expected, right? I could have done it on a Win10-1909 and they did it on 20H2, or they're, and again, the language versions come into play here. So again, if you're looking at this, don't fret about that. That's not the point, right? Actually, before we even talk any further about this, what are we looking at in the first place? This is what we call a patch diff, right? And so with these patch diffs, we have patch diffs effectively here. We're not trying to find a vulnerability. That's already been done, right? So somebody found the vulnerability with Kunlun, I probably butcher on the pronunciation there, but Kunlun Labs identified this and reported it to Microsoft, who subsequently patched it. We have an old version, that's what's on the right. If you look kind of at the split here, right? So kind of coming down here, the old version's on the right, the new version is on the left. And so I'm using a tool here, basically a patch diff tool, to identify what visually, right? What has changed, right? And we actually teach this in SANS Sec 760, right? So that's the Advanced Exploit Development course. And so we show folks how to do this, walk through a couple of examples. Heck, this one may be coming, who knows, right? But like to walk folks through where we get a patch and then we say, okay, well, what changed, right? What is the underlying core of the core of the vulnerability? And this one's a little bit more difficult because you already have to know how to speak RPC, and there's a couple of caveats there, as well. And so anyway, you can see though the highlighted code and all this stuff here that's kind of in pink or red highlighted. These are new instructions. Now the reason this code block here is gray and this one is red, I said gray, tan, and this one's red, is that this code block exists, right? And you can see, in fact, the code block here, these gray instructions, right? So we have a gray line over here. These are instructions that exist here, but not here, right? So exist in the old version, not in the new version. The red instructions exist in the new version, not in the old version. And the red code block is a whole block that doesn't exist even in the, in the old version, right? Now, I want to zoom in because we found the difference. Okay, good, right? Or a major difference. There are some other differences there, but I'm zooming in on this one specifically here because I want to note that this is a completely new function. All right, so we have a completely new function, and then it's followed here by this test EAX. Now, I'm not going to go too deep geek, right? If you're like, hey, this is all Greek to me, rock on. First, it's being recorded, you can go review it, but second, I'll be out of this in the next 5 minutes or so, right? So bear with me for the mitigations piece. But for the rest of us, if you want to kind of hang out here for a second, know that EAX stores the return value, right? So the return value from a function by convention, right? EAX or RAX, depending on whether you're in a 32-bit or 64-bit. Here, they're just testing the low 32 bits of it, but they're checking here effectively and looking to see, is that value 0? Okay, well, that's interesting, right? And so we then see that new code block, right? That, okay, well, but that function's completely new. This function does not exist in the unpatched version. This makes it a prime candidate to, as we do patch diff and we've identified this function's different, right? Well, typically when it's different, we have a kind of thinking about the reversing methodology. We think about the try to think about the, what additional check have they made? Because typically when we think about, vulnerability, it's usually an out of bounds condition or a logic error or whatever that is. In most cases, you're going to have the easy way to patch it, right? Without refactoring all kinds of code, right? Is to make a check at the point where the vulnerability would be triggered and just error out, right? So basically take an error path out. And so it's very common to see an additional, some kind of additional check here. And sure enough, right, that additional check is underpinned by this brand new function that's never been seen before, right? Okay, now I am immediately interested, right, in the fact that R8 is being loaded up with whatever this offset is, right? And by the way, I still don't know what that offset is. I haven't, I had limited time to prepare for this. I have a day job, but separately, just with the time, seriously, with all the time that we put into it, I didn't get to what that specific structure is. RBX is likely storing, at least in this version of the code, right? RBX is likely storing a pointer to a structure. or the base address of a structure. And that offset 24 Charlie or 24C is some interesting piece of data, right, that we're loading into R8. Now, basically, what you're seeing here effectively is R8, R9, ECX, and EDX are being used as the parameters, the first 4 parameters to this function. All right, so that whatever that piece of data is really interesting, or at least moderately interesting, you know, and it's going to be used somewhere in this function. And so let's drop into that function. All right, so we go take a look at this, and we see specifically that this is looking and checking for basically what we call an integer overflow condition, right? So what we're looking for effectively here is to say, okay, well, if we basically, what's being checked for here effectively is the, okay, if once we add these two values together, RCX and RDX, right? Now I'm going to back up here and remember these have been populated here as well, right, with additional data, right? So we're going to add those two values together. We can infer then that these are integers, right, as we think about reversing. And so, because we're adding them together, what else really makes sense there? And so this is not a base plus offset kind of thing here, or doesn't appear to at least be a base plus offset. It appears to be actual adds here. And so we're storing that value in the addition there. We're storing that in EAX. And I'll skip the rest of the complex logic because I promised I'd get us out of here in the next couple of minutes and back out of Geek, right? But suffice it to say here effectively that we are looking for effectively whether this SBB is either going to set EAX to zeros or ones, and here we're going to AND EAX, which is zeros or ones, right? And so we're either going to return a value of 0 or we're going to return this, basically return this code, this hex 80072016, right? I, again, don't know what that means either, right? What I do know is that we're checking for a 0 return value here, right? So 0, not 0 is effectively what that test is. Test is an implied, what we call an implied ANDing operation. We store those bits, right? Okay, now this is where stuff gets fun, right? Because we know now there's integer overflow. As Akamai mentioned, that integer overflow will likely lead to a heap overflow. When you have an integer overflow, one of two things happens, three things. One of three things happens typically. Sometimes it's a logic error, right? You can get to where you have a logic error because of that overflow. Sometimes that triggers a buffer overflow on the stack, and sometimes triggers a buffer overflow on the heap. The heap versus stack just depends on where the data is stored. And in this case, it happens to be on the heap. Right. So the actual heap vulnerability is triggered in a memcopy further down in the function that we looked at. Now, the function that we looked at, this was that we were looking at originally was the process received PDU. Right. One, because when I ran bindiff and it said, hey, which functions are not like the others, right, between the unpatched and the patched version. That was one of the big ones. Also, I had to Google this because I did not remember what scall and ccall meant, despite having done RPC many years ago. S is on the server side, C is on the client side. Now, once we find this function, this brand new function, right, we want to go take a look at where else is it called, because it's likely that it happens very commonly, right? And we cover this again in 760. It happens very commonly that basically a particular function that gets added like this for sanity checks or to check for some vulnerable condition is often called from multiple different locations. And those may also be vulnerable, right? So oftentimes you see like one CVE, right? And it gets, you know, really though what's happening is they're patching 4 or 5 different ways to reach that, or sometimes 4 or 5 different vulnerabilities. In this case, it looks like there are 4 different places. Now, if you're following along at home, there are only 3 talked about explicitly, but hey, rock on. I mean, there's a processed, basically receive PDU. There's also a process response, right? So again, this can be on the client side. I want to highlight here, you know, after kind of talking about this, right? Microsoft did rate the exploitation more likely from the server side, and the client vulnerability is exploitation less likely. Having looked at this code, having seen that there is a vulnerable condition involving integer overflow, which again is going to trigger basically a buffer overflow on the heap. Knowing this, you know, oh, and by the way, that buffer overflow on the heap is going to allow us to gain code execution now. knowing this and knowing that the same code exists and it's processing the same data, all right? I say same data, the same RPC serialized data, over the wire. I got to tell you, like, my delta here between less likely and more likely, I think they made that decision based purely upon, on the server side, I can reach out and just touch the server. On the client side, I've got to trick the client into connecting to a rogue server that sends me basically a bad RPC response that I'm then processing, right? So I got to tell you, from a key takeaway standpoint here, if you're sitting at home thinking like, hey, IT said we can't patch for 2 weeks, right, or a month or whatever, but don't worry, we're just going to block RPC, inbound. I have lots of problems that we'll talk about here in a minute, but separately, I think just blocking inbound RPC is not going to be enough to prevent exploitation, right? So I want to throw that out there. I mean, it is the first step. It's the best thing you can do from a, I feel like it's basic internet hygiene that your RPC isn't exposed to the internet, but think about also your business-to-business VPNs, right? Certainly there as well. But bottom line here, may not be enough to prevent all exploitation. Probably will not be enough, right? Somebody asked about this earlier, Andre. And so, Andre, I was pausing on your question until I got here. But Antonio or Splinter, he mentioned yesterday, he said, hey, I finally found the right conditions to go hit the vulnerable function. Well, first off, we already know that it's not the vulnerable function, it's 4 of them. Or at least 4 where those conditions exist, that Microsoft, the people with the source code, looked and said, we need to protect that function, right? With our brand new, the brand new function that we just examined. He said that he had to create his own custom RPC service to do this. He also noted that it probably shouldn't be common. That's not enough for me to, because I've seen some really whacked out RPC services over the years, right? Lots of third-party code starts RPC services. Your antivirus, almost certainly, your endpoint protection stuff, almost certainly has started some RPC services, right? Yeah, I mean, it's, I'm not confident enough to say, based on, especially not knowing what those conditions are specifically, and I haven't been able to replicate this yet. So until I can replicate it, I'm not confident that this is, kind of in the spot of never going to be exploited or only in fringe cases, or those kind of things. I don't want to make those declarations. That feels a little bit. By the way, I'm not knocking Antonio. I think fantastic work here. But I also don't want to like go, whew, nothing to worry about. Right. So anyway, okay. Want to spend a minute here then, and there's a separate question here, by the way. There's a question about that there might be a exploit for sale on GitHub for like I think it's fairly cheaply. First off, like I'm not buying that. If I had this code and it was weaponized and it was good, $1,100 is not what I'd be selling that at. And so I'm kind of, every time one of these comes out, right? There's always every time there's a big a big O-Day and there hasn't been a proof of concept yet, people race to try to play the, try to scam folks, right? And so $1,100 is right at that price point where some folks might go ahead and pull the trigger, not having seen the demo or proof of capability or any of that. So I'm not saying it's fake. I don't have anything to support that it's real. And we see people manipulate manipulate screen captures all the time with these, and I don't know. I mean, until I see it, I'm kind of right? Yeah. So Marcus asked, can I speak to the claim that there's a specific configuration? No. And by the way, the configuration, want to be super clear here, the configuration would be in the RPC service itself. It wouldn't be something that you would, as a system admin, go flip a registry, registry value from 0 to 1, for instance, right? So like, strict LSA anonymous or something. So yeah. I don't have any information specifically, Marcus. If I did, I probably would be in a spot where I could go crash it now, right, or create the right trigger file now. But even then, there was another conversation between Antonio and Marcus Hutchins yesterday, kind of talking about one of the predicates to even reach that code path, and how neither of them had found a service that in the wild service, right, that basically meets those conditions. In fact, Antonio coded his own service ostensibly because he hadn't yet found a service that met those conditions, wanted to make sure he was on the right track, coded his own service that he knew would allow him to reach that code path. And so the configuration, to kind of put a wrap on this, the configuration is something that would be built by your software developer, right? For that RPC component that you're bringing in. Again, there are tons of third-party RPC components, and even first-party RPC components for that matter, right? And a lot of these questions I'm going to get to either in line or basically as we wrap at the end here. So anyway, I want to go ahead and push forward here a bit. I want to talk quickly about investigating with RPC View. And I know this is a little bit of an eye chart. Don't worry, I'm going to blow up some screenshots here in a second. But the RPC View is an open source tool for examining and investigating RPC endpoints on a live machine. Again, I want to arm you with this because I'm guessing you're going to be asked to do things with RPC that you haven't had to deal with before. Now, also in that earlier link that I mentioned with SpectreOps, they actually walk through or talk about some PowerShell code that you can use. The bad news is that PowerShell code that you would use to go enumerate a bunch of RPC interfaces, and again, it's good PowerShell code, I like it. Defender picks it up as Defender picks up one of the libraries that you need to install as malicious, right? So take that for whatever it's worth. But I know organizations that aren't going to do. They're just not going to be like, oh yeah, don't worry, we trust this person who put this repository out here, and we're just downloading these components into PowerShell. It's not just a PowerShell script; you actually need modules to ultimately with DLL backings, right? And so where's the trust level there? That's on you, right? Okay, but RPC View, really interesting tool here, and free and open source. Gotta love that. So all that said, we can start by just looking at the RPC endpoints. You're going to see some of these. You'll see some of these with the NP, that stands for name pipe. IP TCP, of course, I'm sure you can imagine is exactly that, right? It's TCP. And then these LRPCs, right? So these are the local RPCs, right? So anyway, so you see all of the basically all of the RPC endpoints that you could call. These are shown in the endpoints box. By the way, if you don't run this with admin, you don't see all of them. You see like a really tiny subset, right? So this is a great case of run as admin, right? You can then drill down into the interfaces, and you can see the UUID. This is going to become important in a minute, right, as we talk about logging. And so if I want to log a particular set of RPC services, I can do that if I know the UUID of the service that I want to log, right? You probably don't want to log all of them because that's a disaster, right? That's tons and tons and tons of logs, right? More than I think we can possibly roll with, right? Okay, and then down in the RPC interface, by the way, just to give you the quick drive here, right? This is my endpoints, this is my interfaces, right? So I'm coming from basically from endpoints into interfaces, right? And then I'm coming from interfaces over to procedures, right? So interfaces, or sorry, endpoints, right? Hit endpoints, I get from endpoints, there I got my interfaces, right? And so a particular interface would be something like, let's say, the endpoint mapper, right? And so I'll say, okay, let me go and pick up the endpoint mapper. And I'm going to select one of these. I don't remember which one I selected, but alas, at that point, then I can show all of the procedures, right? Now, if you go run this, just like you download and you don't have debugging tools installed on your machine because you don't do exploit dev or whatever, you're not going to have all this information. What you're going to have is a lot of numbers, right? Like these addresses over here, but none of the names. These names come from symbols, right? So there's documentation with RPC View for how to download Microsoft debugging tools. It's a free download, and then ultimately configure your symbol store locally so that you get all of the symbols and all of the names associated with these. And that's going to help you go Google, because Googling these addresses, you're not going to get anything, right? These addresses change as DLLs are patched, as executables are patched, and they're different across different. Remember that whole discussion about the Hebrew versus, or maybe even just a different version of Windows, right? And so there are different language versions. And so language version versus language pack, language packs generally don't change anything. Language versions do substantially. But alas, Googling this is not going to really help you. Googling this absolutely does, right? So, I can go and find out information about this, right? So you need to configure those symbols to be able to see this if indeed you're called upon to go investigate and say, hey, what is going on with RPC on a given machine? Right? I just want to arm you with tools to put into your quiver, right? So I love the little animation, right? So I hope we come up lucky sevens on this, right? But at the end of the day, I got to tell you that this is a bit of a guess, right? Because they don't have all of, I don't have a proof of concept running yet. And so and there's not a proof of concept public. And so this is going to be just a bit of a guess as to does this work, does it not, right? But I'm confident that even if this doesn't fully mitigate the vulnerability, and again, I don't want to assert with any level of confidence that even doing all this stuff fully mitigates. I'm positive it's going to put you in a better security stance, and it's going to limit the blast radius of a successful exploitation if one occurs, right? So I am confident about all that. This is not time wasted. It's better security posture overall. Let's talk about this stuff. First off, network segmentation. Oh my gosh, do network segmentation, right? You should not have RPC communications workstation to workstation. You just shouldn't have that, right? Generally, you don't have tons of RPC. You have some, but you don't have tons of RPC generally going to most workstations anyway. But so easy, top level recommendations, block communications between workstation subnets. Workstations should never talk to other workstations. If they do, you're talking to a server. Move it into a server subnet. That's it, right? Generally, if I know what good looks like, and I'll talk a little bit about how to map some of that here in a minute. If I know what good looks like, I may block RPC and or SMB communications from server to workstation subnets, right? I already do that, right? My Microsoft SQL server sitting in a server subnet can't reach out over SMB to go talk to any of my workstations. Why? Because why would it, right? So likewise, I have to allow my workstation to talk to my domain controller in SMB. That's sysvol. That's where you get group policy from, among other things. But I don't want my domain controller talking to my workstations on SMB. That's not necessary, right? And so thinking about what is necessary, this sounds a lot like zero trust because it's the foundation of zero trust, right? And then private VLANs, because inside a given VLAN, I want to make sure that those workstations are only talking where that's absolutely necessary. I want to get in and start doing some configurations of host-based firewalls, right? And again, this is, I know that I have limitations with private VLANs in a lot of places. That's hard, right? Here, I want to block RPC communications over TCP port 135, and only allow from expected locations, right? Remember when I did the example with creating a remote service, we use that all the time in lateral movement, right? If you've taken 560, you've done it, right? If you use PS exec in actually not just 560, 504, right? You use PS exec, right? And so if you've used PS exec to laterally move, you've created a remote service. And to do that, you talked to the endpoint mapper. And so I want to block access to the endpoint mapper, right? From places I don't expect to be calling any RPC services, right? Now, of course, the threat actor could connect directly to the service listening on an ephemeral port. That's possible. We talked about those, 1025 to 5000, 49152 to 65535. That does require some scanning. That's noisy too, right? But look, the bottom line here, right, is follow zero trust principles of deny all, permit by exception. And I know that's easier said than done, right? Eric Conrad and Seth Meisenar in the I'm going to lose the number here, but basically in their security operations class, they do a fantastic job of walking through like really good network, not forensics, but more like security operations center monitoring, right? So, anyway, so GMOB and why I'm dropping the number there is beyond me. But so egress, firewall, and service edge filtering. I know people are talking all about inbound. My friends, it's not just inbound, it's outbound too. Right? We've seen that there are, and Microsoft said as much, right? That there were some vulnerabilities in client service, but they're the RPC client services. But I just walked you through the patch diff. And so now you have tangible evidence, right? That you can go back and be like, hey, look, right here, this function that prevents or prevents, detects, and then errors out, detects the integer overflow, and then bails, right? Rather than allowing exploitation, that same function is used in both server and client side code. And so if a threat actor can trick my user into clicking a link or can manipulate some service in a way that, maybe through some level of interaction to go make a connection to a malicious RPC server, it's still game over, right? So we need to be thinking not only about ingress, but also egress, right? So this is a great time to answer Marcus's question here in the chat, or one of Marcus's. I have multiple Marcus's in the chat, but is there any reason that Microsoft mentions blocking port 445 only and not 135? Microsoft obviously knows more about this than I do, right? I'm going to start right there. I don't know is what it comes down to, right? I suspect that this is probably some levels of miscommunication, or I don't know. Yeah, to be straight, I don't know why they only mention blocking port 445 and not 135. They may know the exact specific conditions cannot be achieved alone through only the endpoint mapper, in which case maybe that's why they're doing that. I'm not betting the farm on that because there have been many times that Microsoft has changed guidance, particularly after proof of concept comes out, right? And I want to be super clear. If it ever sounds like I'm knocking the Microsoft security team and their security research team, I am not. They are awesome. They are absolutely awesome, and they're absolutely awesome. But if we roll back last year to Print Nightmare, there was a lot of miscommunication about Print Nightmare. And Marcus, I'm just going to use that as my straw man to kind of hang a shingle on there and be like, hey, yeah, they said a lot of stuff last year too that ended up not being fully, like this is a mitigation, and it was a mitigation. It wasn't a full set of mitigations, right? So I'm not hanging my hat on, that it's only 445. I suspect all the ports that I walked through, or at least 135 and 593, I suspect you probably can trigger that same code. I followed I did take a look at just following a code path, and you can definitely get from RPC over HTTP. You can get to that coalesce function that's vulnerable. Again, there's that spaghetti code inside of there, right? So there's specific conditions that have to be met to even get to that specific code. But short answer is that I think that's probably just a mistake on their part, right? And I see Jacob noted that thought on the MS details are exactly the same as the other SMB knowledge base there. Is that kind of the same, maybe the same, I don't want to use the word used in there, but the same misunderstanding or typo, just like I RCP'd here, the same typo that got us there. I don't know, right? So appreciate that. Okay, rolling forward here, UNC hardening. Ned Pyle. Ned is the SMB subject matter expert at Microsoft. He's a powerhouse. He's been recommending UNC hardening for a long time. Do this, right? And I mentioned here, it's not currently clear if the vulnerable RPC client code, right? Because that's what I'm worried about here is my client code connecting out, if that can be exploited purely through a UNC path. I suspect it can, right? So follow Ned's recommendations. You're gonna be better off from a security standpoint for it. Even if you follow all these, I don't know that totally prevents exploitation, but the proof of concepts that you're gonna see come out that like host their own SMB server, right? When you do SMB hardening, that's not, your clients won't be able to connect to that, right? So it's gonna be a question of, I suspect, could the code still be triggered versus can it be triggered in this specific instance with all the proof of concepts out there? And that's where you're going to win here, right? And then I want to talk quickly about RPC filtering. Ophir and Steve, yes, at Akamai, I'm not going to butcher the rest of the pronunciation there. They have published what they call, and I believe to be the definitive guide on RPC filtering. And they published this a couple of months ago. With RPC filtering, you can create very granular access to RPC procedures and facilitate some advanced logging, all right? So you can come in and add specific conditions. I don't have one here, right? But add specific conditions around basically around like what permissions does a given user have, right, to a given, to a given UUID. Hey, remember earlier when we were in RPC View and we were looking for UUIDs, and I said those would be important later. They are important, right? Because if I want to block or log a particular service, I need to know its UUID, right? So bottom line, though, and this is a question that was asked, or at least talked about earlier somewhere here, I do want to throw out here that every time we have a vulnerability, particularly in a complex system like RPC, we typically see other folks deep dive into this. So I don't think this is going to be the only RPC vulnerability that we deal with over the next couple of months. I suspect that there's probably going to be others. Knowing about RPC filtering and the logging around it, I think it's going to be very, very valuable there. Jonathan Johnson over at Red Canary has a repo with multiple RPC filter examples. You can use this to kind of bootstrap your logging. His doesn't log, right? He's got filtering from a security standpoint, not from a logging standpoint. And so to get the logging, right, if you go download his repo, you may want to change some stuff depending on whether you agree with what he's looking at or not. But you're going to come in, you're going to hit this audit enables, which are going to add to those rules, right? And he's got very granular examples, comparatively. But in order to enable that auditing, you first have to change your audit policy, right? So you have to run this as admin on the system that you want to generate that auditing. So, okay, once you have that, then you get this event ID 5712. Now, I noted earlier, SpecterOps, like 2 years ago, wrote like just an amazing detection engineering guide. They knew about event ID 5712. And as it turns out, they're like, yeah, we never got it to log, right? And so this is where it takes a village, right? Because they were like, yeah, you can't get event logging on it. And here, this other gentleman from Red Canary absolutely has that, right? And by the way, too, SpecterOps has phenomenal amounts of awesome information that's not anywhere else, right? So again, takes a village here when it comes to this security piece. And anyway, with this, you're able to see that remote service that got created, and the service creation event is over in the system log. Event ID 7045 has exactly the same timestamp. You can also track back to, if you want on my remote IP address, just go grab that logon ID, and you'll see where I did the network logon. All right, so the network logon, the 4624, has the remote IP address, actually the name, right? But you can see, the username that was used to laterally move onto this machine to create that remote service, right? So anywho, LAPS and PAM. I feel like we talk all the time about LAPS, but ultimately here, exploitation is going to result in full system access. This is going to give threat actors a lot of privileges here. They are going to pilfer credentials because that's what threat actors do, right? And so it's not just about LAPS, right? By the way, PAM is privileged access management, and privileged account management. But I want you to think about not just, hey, don't worry, we randomized our local admin hashes. We do a red team exercise, and they're like, yeah, we use LAPS, right? And then you go in and LSA secrets. There's, you've got a plain text password, a service account that has admin on every machine. I'm like, neat, right? So anyway, you want to think about this stuff, right? Because once a threat actor compromises one of your systems with this, they're going to be in God mode, right? And so all of this plays in, right? All of this plays in. Now, of course, if you're running credential guard, right, you can take out the LSS memory dumps because threat actor's not going to get them. But otherwise, right, this is still pretty damning, right? So at a minimum, if you can't deploy LAPS, at least threat model around what might a threat actor get, and how can they, basically what might a threat actor get, and how are you going to do detection engineering to go find them laterally moving and abusing the access that they've now gained. Finally, I want to close out here from a detection engineering standpoint or detection standpoint with Zeek and Bro. Zeek, formerly Bro, is capable of logging RPC operations at a very granular level, right? So this is really pulling out the information that we were interested in, or a lot of the information we're interested in the basically in the Wireshark capture or the packet capture, right? Zeek has no problem. Zeek's just like, oh yeah, I see what's going on here, and grabs that data for us, right? And here you can see a call to create service W, right? And Zeek has all that. Likewise here, right? You can see the endpoint mapper, right? But I just wanted to highlight here that you can, like how often does somebody do remote service management, right? Over RPC? I don't know for sure, obviously, but I would guess it's probably not. In most organizations, it's not a very common thing. It is, on the other hand, a great, lateral movement technique, right? Now, I have to throw out here and say that I think the network monitoring is going to be good when it comes down to my logging here. I don't know for sure that you're going to see any attempt, even if you have all the red RPC filters, here, because I think the code's going to crash before the event log gets generated. Or the routine's going to get hijacked, effectively, the overflow, before this gets triggered. But again, for as soon as you patch, right, I do want to know, are people attempting that? And if so, what are they attempting? And I feel like this is going to be a good way to do that. Even separately, having done a bunch of work now with RPC filtering, this is something that I'll be configuring in a lot of my client sites going forward, because why wouldn't I want to know when remote service creation is performed, right? Okay, so I want to close a couple of thoughts out here. We're right at the top of the hour. There is no POC available yet. I believe one is imminent, and I said likely in the next 7 days, but honestly, it's probably sooner than later in that, right? Blocking inbound 135, 445, and 593 by itself will not prevent exploitation. Both the client and the server RPC code are vulnerable, and if patching isn't an option, you want to explore RPC filtering to potentially gain additional telemetry, right? And you're going to get good endpoint telemetry on this. I love network telemetry. We walk through a packet capture. I showed you a screenshot from Zeke doing this. To the extent you can get east-west, east-west traffic, at least to that metadata layer with Zeke, I highly, highly recommend it. You're never going to be worse off for doing that, right? So with that, man, we have a bunch of questions here, and I know I'm not going to get to all of them. I have a good one here, though, that I think I want to talk quickly about here, and it's aside from anything not normal, any tips for hunting evil when it comes to RPC events? No, I mean, we don't know for sure what the proof of concept is going to look like. So that's going to be a hard one here. But to answer that question, Amberly, I think the big thing I'm going to be going for is looking at remote registry services, remote service creation, right? Those are my big ones, because I'm thinking about stuff that threat actors do that involves lateral movement that also goes over RPC, right? So I think remote registry services and service creation, I think, are probably my big two out of the gate, right? And then see what goes from there. Randy notes that there's a tool called RPC Firewall. I haven't used this. I haven't audited the code. I'm dropping this into the chat with the caveat that I haven't audited this. I haven't looked at the code. I don't know if it would be useful or not, but I'm putting it in the chat because right, Randy, Randy gave it to us. We're going to give it to everybody else, right? So final question I'm going to hit here is, actually, two final questions. First off, one, am I aware of Sigma or SEM EDR rules that could be helpful with the specific vulnerability or anomalous RPC behavior in general? No, I'm not aware of that in general. And then specifically, we don't have the proof of concept, so don't know what we don't know. And then the final question I want to answer here is, could this be turned into a local privilege escalation by hosting a self-contained RPC server and connecting to that, right? I don't know. My gut is probably not, because I expect that to do that, I think there's a chicken egg problem here, that you're already going to need to communicate with the RPC controller. And in most systems, I don't think most domain users have that privilege to register a new RPC component. But I'm welcome to be wrong on that. So with that, we're right at the top of the hour, folks. Thank you so much for attending. Thanks, SANS, for sponsoring this. Thanks everybody who contributed, both on the SANS faculty side, knowingly, and folks that put information out there that we use ultimately to test stuff and put this together for the broader SANS community. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope the POC doesn't drop until after that, but patch your stuff and implement hardening to the extent you can. Thanks, folks.